Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Series 1, The Peoples of Chult. I'm your guide, Graham, and this is Lore Diver, the podcast about lore, world building, and alternative takes on all the things that are found there. So, last episode, we left off, and I had covered the main human population of Chult, that being the Chultans, made up of the Tabaxi, Ashowe, and Thinguth tribes that are collectively, of course, known as the Chultans. This week I'm diving into the lore of the only other conventional player race in the area that has a significant presence and population, that being the Dwarves. That's right, Dwarves. Little unusual for pretty much anywhere in any D&D world, but yeah, that's how it is in Chult. So now, right off the hop, if your only exposure to Chult has come through the Tomb of Annihilation, you'd be forgiven for shrugging a little bit here and being like, so what, dwarves? They're dwarves, right? Who cares? Not so much in Chult. There's a whole lot going on in the lore, a whole lot of background and connection to the deeper Dwarven history in the Forgotten Realms. So yeah, let's get into it. So first up, we've got the history in between the editions here, and there's nothing in first, nothing at all. First edition, so far as I'm able to determine, there's no information about dwarves or anybody in Chult aside from the humans that they talk about very, very briefly in a book about Kalmashan. Second edition, things change, and wildly enough, dwarves actually appear in Chult before anything else. The Wild Dwarves, also known as Jungle Dwarves, appear in the book Dwarves Deep from 1990, and this is like a solid 3 years before the Jungles of Chult come out. And so it's kind of impressive. Right away, they're like, okay, we need to put something in Chult. Let's put something there. They decide dwarves, and then things start to go sideways really fast. We'll get on. We'll cover that when I talk about the two different kinds of dwarves in Chult. Yeah, a little bit later. It gets grim, but they're across the peninsula. They're in Chult proper, and pretty much anywhere where there's jungle. In 1993, of course, we got the Jungles of Chult book drops. It is still in many. Until the Tomb of Annihilation released, it was the definitive book about Chult. It was the most detailed. It's the only book that ever focused on Chult, and it brought us more dwarves. It brought us the Albino Dwarves, and arguably, looking through the book, they actually play a bigger role in the adventure in the book than humans do. That's the sort of level that they're at in the area. They're hugely active, quite powerful, and are interacting with their environment in ways that the human population and other groups just aren't. So it's pretty cool. So that was second edition. Third edition, what albinos? So albino dwarves are absent in this edition. I haven't been able to find anything about them anywhere in any of the books that I've been able to get access to. If you know of any, of course, let me know. I'm more than happy to learn more if someone knows. However, Jungle Dwarves, they get an expanded entry. More information comes out about these guys, and it's not good. They double down on the already doubled down on problematic aspects of this group, and it's, yeah. However, third edition also introduced Gold Dwarves to the region, placing multiple settlements of them on the in the Hazard Mountains in neighboring Thundel, which is really cool because it's an autonomous area. They've got watchtowers, they're interacting with people, and they've got their own whole thing going on. That's it's pretty sweet, and definitely worth checking out. We'll talk about them in a minute. So fourth edition, what dwarves? There's none. Dwarves have been excised from the area completely. And yeah, so like as I said in the previous episode about the Chultans, I think, had fourth edition continued, maybe they would have developed the archipelago more. Maybe they wouldn't have not had racist human caricatures instead of, you know, something playable. But nothing really worked out. Like the edition died before anything could change, which probably is not a bad thing. And finally, 5th edition. This is palette swapped shield dwarves. So the slow sort of like constriction and limitation of the number and types of dwarves in the area sort of comes to its natural conclusion at this point. And you've got Jungle Dwarves and Albino Dwarves conflated into the same group more or less, and then sort of statted as shield dwarves in a throwaway sentence about how the Wormheart mines, which were albino dwarf mines in previous editions, were actually shield dwarf mines, and that they've been kicked out and were now living in the jungle, napping flint for a living, and are shield dwarves. Some are albino. Kinda dull. So let's actually get into these groups now. So albino dwarves, these are as close to sort of conventional dwarves as you're going to find in Chult. Mining. They live almost exclusively underground, and they actually use dinosaurs as pack animals, which I think is dope as hell. Like, it's so rare in these games, especially in a lot of D&D settings, to see the peoples actually interacting with the flora and fauna around them, and doing things with them. And here we have, an example of it. It's great. Albino dwarves. We are using dinosaurs for pack animals. We are using them for food and meat. We are using them for all these things. It's awesome. Their mines are almost exclusively like metal and precious stones. And it actually makes a point of mentioning that like they are the source of high-end spell components for the North, which also awesome. Now you have hints of a magical economy happening. Then things get kind of like weird and break completely from the norm, because they are friends with goblins. In fact, they are friends with specifically with the Dimetrodon clan of Batiri goblins. Pardon me. And they're known to trade with them, cooperate with them. They have a respect for them, and they hire them for jobs. And in fact, like it's to the point where you have cultural exchange happening between the two groups, with the green-colored Batiri goblins being described as being like more civilized and more advanced than the other Batiri goblins in the area. And this is nuts, because goblins and dwarves aren't supposed to get together like ever, but here they are doing exactly that. Next up, they have diamond-edged weapons. Not just diamond-edged, but like diamond-edged that give +2 to damage, don't need sharpening, and don't dull. And that's just what they make. And that's awesome. It's one of those things that is great to see, because it's an environmental adaptation to living in an environment that will turn steel into rust in about 3 minutes flat. And the fact they don't need sharpening, they don't dull, and all that sort of thing, that's even better. So, you've got diamond-edged weapons down there, which is, yeah, exactly. We all need to get some of those. Yes. So what else we got on these guys? They're not, mixed relations with humans. Some superstitious Chultans see white as the color of death, and they are albinos, so they don't want to be around them. Other ones who aren't as superstitious have no issues with them. So it's sort of a mixed bag on that. What else? The Wormheart mine is the big mine, and an area in the modern Chult adventure that's taken over by the Fire Newts. And it is guarded, they've got ballistas and pet Dimetrodons. So they have domesticated Dimetrodons as pets and guard animals to protect their mines from attackers. I think that's awesome. Having dinosaur guard animals is fantastic. Obviously, they don't like the jungle too much, and yeah, like they're pretty much the only time you'll see them in the jungle is when they're moving from one mining point to another area, or when they're headed up to like Port Nyanzaru or Mesro or something like that for trade purposes. So that's all pretty good. Like variations on a regular dwarf with some differences, you know, like that whole goblin thing that launched into the whole separate thing for, you know, a coming up episode. Next up, we have the Wild Dwarves, also known as Jungle Dwarves, and oh my, okay, deep breaths here. Okay, so they are dark-skinned. Okay, they appear to be based loosely around either South American jungle peoples, possibly with some New Guinea influences. They use blowguns. They are nomadic. Everything after that goes bad. They appear in the Dwarves Deep Book, where they're effectively depicted as like a slavering subhumanoid. The art for them literally looks like somebody's horrible idea of what like an Australopithecus would look like if it was illustrated back in the day when like our prehistoric ancestors had to be depicted as bloodthirsty lunatics who beat things to death with bones. And then it just like got worse from there. It describes them as coating themselves in grease constantly. Like this is, I don't know what this author's like issue was, but like it's like, oh yeah, you know, they coat themselves in grease. They coat themselves in grease again and again and again. They say this. Coating yourself in grease against insects is not a productive jungle survival trait, especially with the rest of their unsanitary habits. So they coat themselves with grease. They weave their hair around themselves and wear that as clothes. I don't know how that works. At all. And then apparently when they go into battle, they coat themselves in mud and grease. And then there's a whole section on click talking. So it just everything was sideways. About the only good thing that they mentioned was that they tattoo. That's all right. Tattooing is fine. I have a tattoo. That's cool. And then there's like this bizarre statement that, and it was like very specific, that they are cross-fertile with all demi-human races and humans. And I don't know why they felt it was so important to mention that, or why it came up in like each description that I saw for them. Like it only came up once, unlike the grease, which came up again and again and again and again. And yeah, and then of course, just as a final sort of like nail in the coffin of their portrayal, the second image I found of Wild Dwarves from the 3rd edition book, they were white with blonde hair, sort of wrapped around them Captain Caveman style. So yeah, that was Jungle Dwarves. Just grim, so grim. But we're gonna push past that now into the next section. So the history and the campaign setting. There's actually only one specific mention of any of the dwarves in Chult or the area anywhere that I was able to find in the historical record side of things. And let's see, we've got a question here. Do they think making them white would alleviate the racism? Maybe. It still didn't look good. It was like if you crossed a weird Neanderthal with a dwarf and made it blonde and wearing its hair like Captain Caveman. It was not, I don't think it alleviated much, if anything. Back with the history, though, the Drow, in 9,000, minus 9,000 Dale Reckoning, the Drow of Atalanta, in an act of what I will describe as, I don't know, rare competence, managed to actually defeat somebody for once and overwhelm the dwarves at Berendon. Now, this is the modern day Great Rift, and Berendon is huge in Forgotten Realms dwarf history. It was their first major anything. It was like this massive kingdom under the ground, spanning tens and tens and tens, if not hundreds of kilometers. This massive space, dwarves all over the place. Primarily gold dwarves. The shield dwarf population split off prior to that and scarpered off west to establish their own land. And so Berendon was sort of rock and roll and doing its own thing. And then, the Drow, in a competent and organized fashion, finally defeat them. And people, they just scatter. They bombshell out of there, and one large group ends up traveling to the Chultan Peninsula before splintering into small tribal groupings. And that's a quote from the, what's it called there? The Grand History of the Realms. There we go. And eventually became known as the Wild Dwarves. That's the only mention of them anywhere in the historical record. That's it. So now we're going to get into a little bit of speculation on my part, and say that there was one large population that fled down that route. Of that, there's likely 4 significant subgroups in it. One group would insist on pushing through along through the Underdark, eventually having it collapse behind them and continuing to move on and becoming the dwarves that were found in Mazdaca, which left 3 groups behind. The groups left behind, you have the Wild Dwarves, and they're the ones who, for one reason or another, decide to stay on the surface. You have Albino Dwarves, who decided to push on into Chult proper and stay underground to avoid the heat, suffering some sort of mutation at some point, causing albinism to become a dominant trait in their population too. And they did their best to try to replicate the lives they'd had in Berendon. So they established mines, underground settlements, all that sort of stuff, and just retreat further underground the longer they're there. And then finally the Gold Dwarves, of course, they're the Gold Dwarves. They stayed in the Hazar Mountains and were like, we're good here. We're just going to sort of set up, live our lives. Now, there's one more note I'd like to make here with the Wild Dwarves. And that's that, dwarves are generally are pretty cut and dried culturally. It's one of the reasons why, personally, until I did this research into the Dwarves of Chult, I never really found them super interesting as a group to play, just because they were so dull. However, the Wild Dwarves here kind of throw a wrench into that and got me thinking, because Thardhar is the god of jungle survival for the dwarves, and that's a really, really specific thing to be a god of. And so what I suspect is that at some point in the past, Thardhar may have once been a more basic god of survival and the wilderness prior to that. However, with Berendon and the dwarves and so on becoming an increasingly urbanized population, one that had less and less use for a survival god, he sort of started to fall by the... let's see here. Yeah, there's a reason why our dwarves are all the same as a trope. Exactly. Something happened, though, and I suspect there was a cleric of Thardhar with these dwarves who were fleeing, who managed to convince a fair number of them to follow them onto the surface and survive, and that they would become a big thing. And this also may feed into, and I neglected to mention this earlier when I was talking about the Jungle Dwarves, and that's that the Jungle Dwarves, as they're described, actually don't make any sense. They read like somebody was trying to cross like a really bad idea of how a hunter-gatherer society works with how they think a wolf pack might work, because it describes them as only existing in like essentially giant hunting packs, and goes to extreme efforts to try to drive home that like they don't understand what families are, they don't understand what group is or how group functions, and that it's driven home in their culture again and again and again that you're alone, you'll always be alone, nobody loves you, you're going to hunt for your next meal and then die and hopefully mate along the line somewhere. And it doesn't make any sense at all, because literally no population can survive by doing that. That's social. Like you can't. It just does not work at all, and it just sort of it doesn't feel right. And not only does it not feel right, but it just, yeah. I got a comment here. That doesn't sound like any possible society. Exactly. Like, if that's the description, then let's see. Wait, were they comparing that to wolves? No, they weren't comparing it directly to wolves. It was wild animals was the term that they used a lot, and so I literally can't imagine anything except for like a really bad idea about a wolf pack or something like that, being their example. Like maybe they watched like some ancient nature documentary that just talked about lone wolves all the time or something like that. Because it doesn't make any sense. And not only did it not make sense, but it just made them like really unpleasant, and it didn't make them make any sense, because it talked about how they raised their young communally within the group, and that's not something that produces people that feel alone. That's something that produces a strong sense of interconnectedness between people, because you're relying on each other to raise all the children. And it would go on and on about this, and sort of like intersperse more stuff about Greece and mud and wearing their hair. So it just, it was not good. Full stop. So what's the current state of dwarves in the campaign setting? And it was a mess. Like 5th edition has gotten a lot of things right, and credit where credit is due. They have managed to introduce lizard folk, goblins, tieflings, like all these groups into the game, and it's fantastic. So they've done a lot of good work in that sense. In other areas, and especially in and around Chult, though, things have not gone as smoothly. And so you went from like 2 unique groups to 1 unique group to no unique groups, except for like a few, like, I can cast a nature spell as a special ability. And for me, that's not fun. It makes the setting less unique. It takes flavor out of it. And it somehow actually makes it less fun than the original mud grease hair covered operation and like albino miners from previous editions. So as it stands right now, the Albino Dwarves are palette swapped shield dwarves who were driven from their minds and decided over the course of about 40 years, of the 40 years that they were driven from their minds, that they just weren't worth making a serious effort to take back. And this falls into that whole agency thing again, that there's all too often groups in these sorts of world building operations have no agency, and they have no desire to make change in their lives, even when they probably should, or can remember how awesome life was when they were living in their minds and not underneath an alternating tropical hell sun and monsoon rain. So yeah, they've just been sort of like hanging out, hoping someone will help them retake their minds. They didn't start any new mines. They didn't move into any of the old ones. They didn't apparently have any of their old mines left anymore. And they're just sort of sitting around, growing moss in the jungle, napping flint, and talking about how cool it was back when they used to be able to make metal. So that's not fun. Like, there needs to be more to it than that. And especially with like the lore, like the background. I mean, it's not like there's a lot of it. Like, there's only a few books you need to check out to get ideas. And so I'm just gonna dive right into some takes here on like how to change things up, how to maybe improve things, add some more interest into the game for your players. And so, like right off the hop, I would scrap the shield dwarf aspects from the Tomb of Annihilation. Shield dwarves are awesome, but they are specific to like the north and the heartlands and that, the Sword Coast, that part of the world. And that's awesome. Let Chult have its unique dwarves back. Switch back to the older lore. Okay, yeah, there are shield dwarves in the area. They've come down from the north with all the other adventurers, all that sort of stuff. That's cool. Do that. And roll with it. But, there should be some pretty serious culture shock when they encounter the indigenous dwarves of Chult. Like, just imagine that for a moment. Like, you're a dwarf, you're from the north, you've spent your whole life, learning to hate goblins, orcs, and giants, and all that sort of stuff. You travel down to Chult on an adventure, run into these albino dwarves who are working with goblins. They're not stabbing each other. They're not, like planning to betray each other, but like they're working with them. They're friends. They're high-fiving, whatever. That's the sort of thing that, like, what's happening here? How did this occur? Why is this happening? What kind of dwarves are you? And it's that's sort of like, it doesn't sound like a huge thing, but it's something you can add into the game to sort of make it drive home to, like, how unique the area is. So next up, okay, Jungle Dwarves. They should be back, but with this time something approximating a functional society and culture, not just a bad mix mash of like wild animal traits and colonial nonsense about how they think hunter-gatherer societies exist. Because there is a lot of cool potential there. I mean, having a population of primarily surface-dwelling dwarves is cool. Like, it's a good idea. And it gives, it helps break up the monotony of the otherwise, like scaled or amphibious sorts of groups that make up the bulk of the rest of the population of the place. Okay, and what I would see, like, do they have hair? Yeah, but it's not being, worn as clothes, because that's stupid. It would be hot. It would be unsanitary. I mean, like, imagine literally growing your hair out so long you can weave it around your body as clothes, and then go out in the jungle in that. So it's like 45, 50 degrees Celsius, or whatever that is in Fahrenheit. I have no idea. Just shy of 100% humidity, and you're wearing your hair as clothes that you've also like covered in mud because you think you might get into a fight this day. That's just no. So yeah, give them some serious dreads. Have them wearing them different ways and styles to show off their positions and status in their groups. Okay, make them a legit hunter-gatherer societies. Keep the communal aspects. Drop the we're alone, we don't know what family is. Get rid of all that nonsense. Keep the tattoos. Tattoos are cool, and not a lot of dwarves have serious tattoos. Not a lot of like D&D player races at all have serious tattoos, and there's only a few that I've seen, at least I've seen, where they mention like any sort of tattooing tradition. So like, come up with a cool tradition for it. Maybe it's art, maybe it's a brag sheet for all the things they've done. So do that. Ditch the grease and mud armor. And make them, if they're wearing grease, it's like grease paint or something like that for camouflage, because they are ambush hunters. They are dwarves hunting dinosaurs in the jungle. So yeah, like, have them all cammed up out there doing their thing. That's awesome. Setting pit traps and all that sort of fun stuff. And I'd have them on like poor terms with most of the other peoples of Chult, mostly because of competition for resources. So they can learn to tolerate sharing space as long as it means they're not sharing food and water and stuff like that past an amount that's sustainable. So that's them. Albino dwarves. So Albino dwarf isn't a great name, at least in my opinion. I would rather see something like ash dwarf or something like that, because it's associated with the volcanoes that they make their homes in. So it makes them a little bit more specific and not just describing a trait that literally any dwarf population can produce as their defining feature, and make them their own cultural operation. Keep that Batiri Goblin thing going on. That's awesome. It adds, makes things different. It makes things more unique. And like not only that, but like after generations of this sort of cooperation, like what's it doing with the goblins? This is something that I'll go into next week. But it's something it's been something that I've been thinking about this entire time. Now, other stuff, okay, they are masters of the forge, like bar none. Like last week I talked about how they should be in charge of like all the metal happening in Chult should be them. Yes, it should be them, and not just that, but they're using volcano forges, and that is their preferred method of working. Now they've lost those main forges and settlements to the fire newts following the breakthrough into their territory, and for the first time in their history, they're at war. Like they were a refugee population getting away from a war, like what, 11,000 years ago, something like that, and now they're actually going to war. They're trying to reclaim their lost lands and treasures, and that opens up a ton of adventuring opportunities. They're looking for magic users, they're looking for adventurers, they're looking for specific tools or other things that they need in order to take their lands back. Maybe they're also looking for like supply, just like people to run supplies to like where their peoples are staying and things like that. Have them doing tons and tons and tons of things, being proactive and getting into it, but just don't have them in the jungle, sitting around like, hey guys, remember how we used to make metal? Yeah, that was awesome. Well, I guess I'll nap another flint knife today. That's boring. And then as a bonus, have the goblins fighting beside them. Okay, like these are goblins that are more advanced technologically and more sophisticated culturally than any other ones on the peninsula, if arguably not the world. Okay, and like more on that next episode. But this should be like a big aspect of that. And yeah, like get them interested, get them interesting, give them agency, because agency drives, in my experience, player interest. If you offer the players a group that are just like a bunch of sad sacks lying around, they might take the bait. If you offer them a dynamic situation where a group is actively trying to do something and you can get them to buy into that, they will feed off that energy, because they'll be like, yeah, like he wants to do it, we want to do it, let's do this. And this is just, this is a off point. So all these books have made a point about how these dwarves can like reproduce with any demi-human species, and when groups mix, stuff happens. And in this case, I legit see an argument for goblin dwarf hybrids. I see that argument here. The Batiri aren't under the sway of the goblin pantheon, and their closest allies, trade partners, and probably only friends in the entire peninsula are, at least according to the older books, the Albino Dwarves. And they're also not even like the same size. They're bigger than regular goblins. So, like some may argue against it, but this is a thing that I think could be an option. I mean, they've spent like 100 years surviving the spell plague together. So, why not actually have some sort of like realistic reaction to that? So yeah, Goblin Dwarves should be a thing. Next up, we got Gold Dwarves. Hey, thought I forgot about them? No. Hey, the Gold Dwarves don't need a huge description. Like I don't really need to do a lore dive into them within this context, because these are Gold Dwarves more or less by the book. They're still in the Hazard Mountains. The unique thing that they've got going on is that they have a partially flooded Underdark area, and they're fighting against the Koatoa. That's their main threat. as opposed to like goblins or, I don't know, grimlocks or hook horrors or whatever else happens to be crawling around in normal Underdarks. And they've been cut off for over a century. I mean, the Hazar Mountains were the Hazar Islands in 4th edition. So they actually made it through the explosion of Halrua, the wiping out of the peninsula, everything else. Like, they survived. And not only did they survive, but so did the Thingoth human mercenaries and their families. They hired to man a lot of their fortifications because they were constantly low on, dwarf power because they were spending so much time fighting Koatoa. And now the peninsula is back and things are awesome, except there's Yuan-Ti, and Yuan-Ti are going to be part of a huge, I don't even know how many. There's going to be multiple episodes about the scaled races in Chult because they're just such an integral and important part of the whole operation. But the Yuan-Ti are trying to break back out. Hazard's probably trying to break back out because they want to establish trade and everything else like that. And I think that building up the Gold Dwarves, their strongholds, even if they did some sort of like, I don't know, like Kingdom Above, Kingdom Below sort of thing, where you have like the Gold Dwarves have all the mine stuff in the Hazard Mountains, and you've got Thingoth humans living on the outside or something like that, and they're working together or some sort of deal along those lines. But have them as a power, like give them a city, give them give them a city-state sort of status or something like that. And there's a few reasons for this. Number one, it's cool. Number two, it puts an alternate jumping off point onto the peninsula. As it stands right now, there's not a whole hell of a lot going on there. Like there's only Orm Patur survived, like the city that survives everything, up in the Lapal areas. And everything else is pretty much like was wiped clean and then reconstituted. So it's sort of wide open. And putting this city there, it gives you an alternate entry point into Chult. So you land in the Hazar Mountains, travel across the plains of Thindol, which gives your players a chance to adapt and get used to sort of the unique flora and fauna and all that sort of thing before they hit the Chultangar, and now they're in the Chult itself. So I think that's a good idea. Like it gives a nice alternative area to base everything out of. One that's a little bit more familiar if your players need a little bit more time to acclimatize to different cultural operations and stuff like that. So yeah, I like that idea myself. And finally, I really see the Dwarves of Chult. They're they're unique in comparison to their more conventional brethren because of the specific environmental pressures being placed on them. It's not like anything else that dwarves generally experience in their lives. Like most dwarves, it's either underground or cool temperate climates for the shield dwarves. Gold dwarves are living in warm temperate subtropical areas, still nice weather. And then you've got these dwarves living in Chult. It is a tropical monsoon rainforest filled with undead dinosaurs and a ton of races that are older than any of them. And so like this puts the pressure on. And I think that having these unique groups in Chult, it gives that bit of extra difference to it. Like in my mind, like when I think about Jungle Dwarves, they've adapted to surface life to a degree that no other population of dwarves ever has. And they should be like some just crazy druids, barbarians, and rangers, just dominating the landscape over their territories. Slipping through the underbrush, not being seen by people that they don't want to see them. Like they should be filling that like ambush predator, wild elf sort of niche, because there aren't a ton of wild elves in the area. And I think that'd be awesome, instead of like watching up into the trees, watch out for the underbrush, because there are jungle dwarves there who are going to just swarm you over, stab you up, and be gone before anyone knows what's going on. Next up, the Albino Dwarves or the Ash Dwarves, masters of metal and gems, producing works that are everybody wants, almost no one can afford, and instead of just being, like, this is our new dwarf, but with a twist, they actually have twists that aren't just, a different hat or, a palette swap. And it, especially, this relationship they have with the goblins and the sheer amount of time that they have been in Chult, definitely deserves, some sort of effort to, at least make them cool. And Gold Dwarves, Gold Dwarves just keep on keeping on. They have unique pressures and issues, but they're not as crazy, and they're also the ones who are, they're looking around nation building and recovering their whole lives as opposed to dodging undead and dinosaurs. And the other thing that I'll mention here, because it's appropriate as the first demi-human group that we've talked about, is that theology in the Forgotten Realms has never been particularly concrete or well laid out. And the presence of dwarves in Chult for so long, to me, indicates that the argument that Ubteo should not be and never was actually like the main god over the area, it bolsters that argument, simply because under his authoritarian rule, and this is from the Ring of Winter novel, he was in charge of everybody. If you died in Chult, you got sent back as a member of the undead if you couldn't answer his riddle, which was the maze of your life. And he did this for everybody. And it was played as a joke in the book because, this wizard companion of Artis Kimber dies and is being zapped back and forth between being a ghost on, in the real, ghost on the material plane, and then Mistra will send someone down, snatch him, try to bring him back over to her afterlife, only to have Ubteo come and like grab him back and throw him back at Chult, which is a pretty horrifying way to spend your afterlife. And I can't see anybody staying in Chult if every time someone dies, they get sent back as a member of the undead. Because this is the sort of thing, like, even cremation doesn't protect against it. Like, you could begin burial practices designed to prevent the dead from rising, and that's fine, except for Ubteo, because, he's a jerk. It's just going to send him back as an incorporeal undead. It's like, oh, hey, yeah, they destroyed your body. I was going to send you back as a zombie, but I guess you'll be a phantom, and you can be a specter, and you'll be a ghost. That's just not on. And so something that I would like to see, and something like ideas that I'm still myself still working on, is, what is a better way to sort of like build the theology and the cosmology around in Chult in such a way that it makes sense, and doesn't have 12,000 years worth of undead dwarves running around, because they didn't worship Ubteo and didn't understand the maze thing, and so every single last one of them was brought back from the dead as a member of the undead to haunt their families. So yeah, but it's something that I feel that needs to be mentioned, and it also ties into the whole, how much coverage do demi-human deities get over members of the group they're gods for. Like, what happens if a dwarf is worshiping a different god and they die? Do they still get snapped up to like the dwarf afterlife, or do they get to go to the afterlife of the god that they were following? Coming here, yeah, Grandpa's back. Pack your bags, kids. We're fucking. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, yeah, guys. Yeah, we had a hunting accident. We lost a bunch of guys. They're following us right now, so we need to move camp immediately. All right. So what do we got up here? Comment here. Ubteo, I'm technically neutral. Yeah, very, very technically neutral. So next episode, goblins. Specifically Batiri goblins. They're not normal. They're not typical by any means. The TOA representation of them was not great, and there's so much more cool stuff going on with them. And depending on how much information I have to work with that, it's either going to be an episode all about Batiri goblins, or it's going to be an episode about Batiri goblins and Grung. Because damn it, I love me some little poison frog humanoids that should be available for player characters to play. I think that's awesome. All the other things we're allowed to play now are available to play in the game. Grungs should be one of them. So that brings us up to the end today. A little bit of a shorter show than the other day, but still not too bad. I'd like to thank everybody who came out for listening. This has been Lore Driver, the POCGamer podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to see more, head over to my blog, POCGamer.com, and check out POCGamer on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. More Twitter and Instagram than Facebook. Look, just be honest with you, right off the top there. And if you'd like to support this podcast, there's links to my coffee on my blog and social media. The music was provided by purple-planet.com. And thank you very much for listening. You guys have a great night.